5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
High and low, it's how I roll. A shooting star in a film noir. I'm floating around 10 feet on the ground. I'm floating around 10 feet on the ground. I am no average Joe. Be with me and you will see. More than you ever wanted to.
Hey there, it's John Baranchuk coming at you with a redo of Grasping Sasquatch from my 22nd episode, where I examined the scientific method. Had all kinds of technical glitches, unlike the ones I'm having now, having forgotten to put the cat up. But we're going to re-explore that show that was a technical nightmare, and we're going to re-explore it at a much more leisurely, laid-back pace. We'll just have to put up with the dogs and cats. As is my habit, I always have a story related to the to the topic at hand. And last night, when I did the original of this show, I couldn't find a story. But since then, it occurred to me that I did have some stories related to the scientific method and the use of statistics. You'll find this in Sasquatch, Legend Meets Science by Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum, beginning at page 213. So as my habit, I'll read this story. It's rather a long one, but we're not rushed for time. How nice. And we'll see how things go. After that, we'll review the scientific definition of a psychological scientific hypothesis. And we'll take it from there. We'll look at a model. We'll look how that scientific method could be applied to fishing. We'll look at how it currently is being applied, or lack thereof, to Bigfoot. So without further ado, in a slightly fuzzy hat, I had everything adjusted, but it's changing with the light in the room. So we'll get after it. As I said earlier, I'm reading from the Bible of Bigfoot, Sasquatch Meets Science, Scientific Bigfoot, the Bible of Scientific Bigfoot, Legend Meets Science by Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum, beginning at page 213. The second paragraph on that page. Reported sizes of Sasquatch encountered from the range of over 4 feet to nearly 14 feet. I've lost. With an average of 7.5 feet in terms of hair, or in terms of height. Hair was straight and short to medium. Half of the reported colors were black or dark, 1/4 were brown, 15% were light in color, and 8% were gray. Only 14 of the reports made any mention of a noticeable smell. Posture was usually erect with a stoop. It's possible to distinguish natural patterns in such observational data. And I would point out that that is not only observational data, but it is data that's important and is used in descriptive statistics. In a future show, we'll get together and we'll look at the normal curve, the bell-shaped curve, that defines what's normal, moderately impaired, or mildly impaired, moderately impaired, or severely impaired, or different, and normal, mildly, better, larger in this case, moderately larger, and extremely larger is what the curve, the normal curve, breaks down to. And he's using that, and that's how he got these descriptive statistics on Bigfoot. Is it possible to distinguish natural patterns in such observational data concerning Sasquatch from the inherent randomness that one might expect of fabrications and hoaxes? There are many patterns within the data that would be suggestive of a living population rather than a fictitious phenomena. Dr. Henner Fehrenbach, retired micropist, formerly with the Oregon Regional Primate Research Center, has published a statistical analysis of reported Sasquatch dimensions based in large measure on Dr. Green's, or Tom Green's, I believe his first name is, data. He limited his analysis to those reports emanating from the Western U.S. and Canada. Dr. Fehrenbach states, a sufficiently large sample, as we have for many measurements, has the advantage of supporting through such treatment either an origin of a living population or animals, or conversely exposing a set of fictitiously generated values. So this is interesting. He's using statistics from this database of Green's foot casts and footprints to talk about what's normal or abnormal in Bigfoot. Dr. Fehrenbach states, a sufficiently large sample size, as we have for many measurements, has the, here we go. With a large enough sample, it can be presumed that any biological patterns present may emerge from extraneous outliers. An extraneous outlier would be somebody who is more than 3 standard deviations, 4 or 5 standard deviations from, quote, normal. Normal is the height where that curve, the bell-shaped curve, is at its highest. And then average is 1 step lower to 1 step higher. Once you hit 1 step higher, then you're at either a mild difference or in the negative range, or a mild difference in the positive range. 2 standard deviations, moderate difference. 3 standard deviations, high difference or strength. It's a high strength or high difference, and then beyond 4, you begin to look at outliers. 4 standard deviations from the norm is pretty extreme. Back to the read. First off, Fehrenbach examined patterns in the frequencies of footprint dimensions. He noted that footprints are the standard stock and trade of Sasquatch research and have the advantage of providing a degree of objectivity not always attainable with other categories of observational data. Even so, evaluating a footprint dimensions is a different matter than, say, taking a standard measurement of bones in a museum cabinet. An individual footprint is trace evidence of an interaction of the Bigfoot with the variable conditions of the substrate being the soil. Apparent dimensions can be influenced and distorted by the dynamics of walking, slide-ins, drag-outs, curled toes, depth impression, foot rotation, and other factors. The measured greatest length of individual footprints, even in a single trackway, may vary by as much as 10 to 15%. All these factors introduce intra-individual variation that will affect derived correlations and indices. So he's taking the observational data, these footprint casts, and he's taking a scientific method, creating descriptive statistics about these footprints. And that, those last two statements, they're already telling you about the variation and how that might introduce some error into his descriptive statistics. Because all descriptive statistics can do is kind of take an average, if you will. It's evidence, it's scientific evidence, but much of this would be needed and other kind of scientific experiments and studies to prove Bigfoot as a known species. A large proportion of continuous frequency distributions in nature approximate a normal distribution. So we're back to this normal curve, okay? So when you look at the population is considered the entirety of that particular data set or part of that experiment. And he's saying that they occur on a normal distribution. So the shape of Bigfoot's foot and variation in footprints is similar to ours, even though their footprints are much larger than ours. They both exist in the distribution of a normal curve, but the Bigfoot prints obviously are bigger. Fehrenbach found that a sample of Sasquatch track lengths distribute in a somewhat peaked bell-shaped curve. The range of variation of footprint lengths included from 4 to 27 inches. So the longest footprint they can account for is 27 inches long. That's 9 inches from 3 feet. And the smallest was 4 inches, with an average of 15.6 inches long and a standard deviation of 3.1 inches. So he's calling his Bigfoot foot data set the population. Technically, it's a sample of the population. He's referring it, in this case, to his population. But the correct nomenclature would be better. He's got a sample of the population of Bigfoot footprints. To have a population of Bigfoot footprints, you'd have to wrangle every Bigfoot in the United States and take their footprint measurements. You can't do that. The distribution does not suggest extreme sexual dimorphism or what's known as a marked difference between the size between the males and the females. So that's interesting. There's not a gender effect in terms of the distribution or the size of a Bigfoot male compared to a Bigfoot female full grown. Now, does that mean that therefore the males have bigger feet than the females? Well, let's read on. Fehrenbach acknowledges at most it can be speculated that at the median, which is an average size, but it disregards outliers. That's another way to say that. It's median is one of the measures of what's average, but with the median, the influence of those outliers and the influence of the 3 standard deviation feet are accounted for. 3 standard deviation size, greater size, is accounted for using that particular measure of the mean. Again, it's the median, and it's more resistant to the influence of outliers. And so he's saying, given that, there's not all that much difference. The sexual dimorphism does not exceed 2 inches in foot length, or roughly 1 foot in body weight, since the measurement data were summarized in 2-inch intervals. It should be recognized that the sample is not necessarily limited to fully adult individuals. So that average footprint of 15.6 inches long, they factor in the influence of the 4-inch footprints, which is why they use that median rather than the mean for a calculation for what's average. A slight negative skewness of the distribution suggests the contribution by juveniles presumably included within the sample. Fehrenbach reasons the normal distribution overall argues for a cryptic species in that the production of fictitious data over 40 years by hundreds of people individually of each other would have generated distributions with many peaks. In other words, it's going to be pretty rare for everybody to have the same faking feet to use when they hoax. And simply because they're using different size feet and different models of feet, there's going to be a larger standard deviation, a larger distance between that average size and the average size of, say, a faked footprint. I think I'm going to end it there. He goes on to say that it's clear there is a slightly larger range of variation in the Sasquatch sample. On this point, Fehrenbach notes, it's very probable that's the Sasquatch population being composed. Now he's going from his sample, and he's using the word population. So now he's doing inferential statistics without having calculated an inferential statistic. He's using logic and reasoning. And this is where the error in any research can come in. It's very probable that the Sasquatch population, being composed of animals with a long lifespan, few offspring, and little culling by predators, will display a wide physical variation. So even though their feet sizes are distributed very similarly to humans under that normal curve, he's saying the standard deviation, or the variation between 1 foot compared to another foot compared to another foot, is larger than in the human population. He goes through some statistical extrapolation from the gorillas. Extrapolating further, it could be predicted that a Sasquatch with a mean foot length of 15.6 inches would stand 7 feet 10 inches tall and weigh 658 pounds. An 18-inch footprint equates to an 8-foot 4-inch Sasquatch weighing 768 pounds. So the data what he's doing there is still falling short of an experiment, or he's not milking that data for all it's worth by only using descriptive statistics. If he either had a larger sample or chose to, he might be able to have done a t-test, which would tell us, is there a real significant difference between a human footprint and a Bigfoot footprint? But he hasn't gone that far. And that's a good place to revisit the scientific method, because the scientific method that I'm advocating for is using more experimental data, so that you don't have to make those logical. Well, you don't have to make those logical conclusions or interpretations. He's making conclusions and interpretations based on a variety of variables than the actual test results. If he had gone further and did t-test, then we'd have greater scientific certainty in his results. Now, that's not saying that I'm saying the results are invalid. I'm not saying that the results should be thrown out. This was quite a research study, and I'm showing you where the Bigfoot community back then, and certainly most of the Bigfoot researchers now, most fall short by throwing away their data and not reducing it down to numbers to statistically analyze and even get a look at the normal distribution and how that data compares to it. But he's gone that far to look at it on the normal distribution. And when we discuss that on my show on that topic, we will be able to check it out and look at it a lot closer, and that'll be interesting. I don't know about fun, but interesting. So moving on with the scientific method, I'm going to go at this at a much more leisurely pace than I did our last show, 23 minutes in, and break it down a little bit slower. I'm going to use a psychological definition in that much field research, the experiential field research that we've all been doing, attempts to capture Bigfoot behaviors and inform attitudes, thoughts, and emotions for the same. And this is where psychology is just perfect for scientific investigation of Sasquatch. You can't see an attitude, you can't see thoughts, but behavioral markers will inform those attitudes and thoughts and emotions. You can't see an emotion, but psychological science's abilities to quantify emotions for humans speaks to a unique ability to do so in the case of Sasquatch. Such a psychological definition of the scientific method seems particularly suited for our studies. That's kind of the point I just made. The scientific method is a general set of procedures for gathering and interpreting evidence that limits sources of error, yields dependable conclusions, and demands specific attitudes and values of the scientist. Okay, so the emphasis there is limiting sources of error. That's done through your statistical analysis and the p-value you get, which is a value that tells you not the probability, but the percentage likelihood that your results are due to random error. And generally you want those at 0.05 or 0.01. 0.05 meaning there's a 5 out of 100 chance of random error, and 0.01 being there's 1% chance of random error. Those are scientifically accepted values in psychology. These special attitudes and values include, but are not limited to, motives driven by a curiosity about the unknown and uncertain, in which we seek discoverable laws, orderly patterns of relationships in the target phenomena. We remain critical and skeptical of all conclusions while simultaneously maintaining a necessary open-mindedness that makes truth provisional and ready to be modified by no data, never absolute. Even when it becomes a law, it continues to be evaluated and tested. But let's look at these motives. They're kind of paradoxical in many ways. So your motives are driven by curiosity about the unknown, sounds perfect for Sasquatch, and uncertainty about in which we seek to discover the Sasquatch and create laws about the Sasquatch's behavior and phenomena. We're looking at orderly patterns of relationships in the target phenomena. We're looking for order out of randomness. We remain critical and skeptical of all conclusions. And I think it's real important to note that skepticism is part of a good scientific method. But then it says, in addition to the open-mindedness, or in addition to the skepticism, you've got to simultaneously maintain a necessary open-mindedness. Okay, so you got to be skeptical and open-minded at the same time. That can be a challenge. And you got to be ready to modify your hypothesis based on your data, or make a different observation and move on to another study. A respect for data as the ultimate arbitrator of disagreements and as the cornerstone of basic knowledge is also a basic value. So we let the data tell us. Secrecy is banned so that all data may be publicly verifiable, that being open to inspections, criticism, and replication by other researchers. Scientific knowledge is built on the base of empirical evidence obtained by observation. So there are two forms of empiricism, at least, Jessica. But in general, empiricism includes observation and measurement, rather than solely on the basis of authority beliefs and other dataless experts. I love that last sentence because our community runs rampant based on authority beliefs that develop into dataless experts. We got to let the data drive us. Part of where the Bigfoot community is falling down is data to us represents the phenomena. Okay, I would call the rock clacks, the footprints, the tree knocks, the howls, the woo experiences. All those are the phenomena. Those phenomena are then coded in a way and reduced down to numbers, and that's the actual data that you analyze with a computer. Also, an authority beliefs. There's a lot of them out there, and a lot of dataless experts. And another one of the weaknesses, therefore, in our community is dataless experts. So that means that we go from an observation to an idea to a theory without ever doing any hypothesis testing on it. And the reason that has evolved within the Bigfoot community, even in active researchers, most people just don't know how to do statistical analysis. Doesn't mean they're lousy researchers. It means they're incomplete researchers because they're not taking the step of developing hypothesis, getting the raw data, turning it into numbers, and then doing statistical analyses of those numbers so we can say things with scientific certainty rather than these authority beliefs. Right now, most of everything of what we know about Bigfoot, there are some exceptions, feet being one of them, or know or believe about Bigfoot even, is dataless. It's based on our jumping from an observation to a belief that this is the theory for Bigfoot. Well, in the scientific method, before you ever get and start thinking about a theory, you got to run experiments and do hypothesis testing and analysis before you start thinking about something as a theory. Once your hypotheses are repeatedly confirmed, when you continue to hit that hypothesis target, you then begin a tentative theory and do theory testing in the same way. Once that theory, we've hit the target with that theory, we call it a theory, but what do? We go on with more testing to confirm that it's a valid theory. That's not happening in getting from observation to theory in the Bigfoot community. And that's also what makes bias a terrible, terrible thing. And that's why I've done several shows on minimizing bias. Data is collected using methods to eliminate or correct for subjective influences of the researchers, increasing their objectivity. Inferences and conclusions about the meaning of evidence are kept distinct from the description of the data and methods for collecting them. So we're using data collection methods and analysis methods and experimental design methods to eliminate or correct subjective bias and be more objective. You don't jump from number of tree knocks you hear with your small group is the Bigfoots telling us they know how many are in our group. That went from an observation and was presented as immediately as a theory. There wasn't systematic hypothesis testing going on that theory, or on the hypothesis of that theory first. So, you got to replicate that multiple times. It could be that sometimes that happens. Okay. Sometimes it doesn't. It could be a coincidence or a correlation, but we're trying to prove cause. And that's what we got to do to prove Bigfoot is scientifically prove that Bigfoot is a creature, a distinct creature, scientific evidence, scientific proof. At some point, you'll write up your findings if you've hit the target with your hypotheses. And you'll write it up, and you'll either allow other scientists to review it and then publish it, or you'll publish it and then let other scientists review it. That's typically done in a journal, a peer-reviewed journal. But in writing up that paper, you'll have one section from the description of the data, footprints, a specific section on how you came about those footprints, the methods for collecting them. And then you're going to have a separate section on your experimental design procedure to show how that guards against systematic error, or that scientist bias coming into play, or other external environmental factors influencing your experiment. Basic to such research is a reliance on empirical methods of investigating the mysteries of nature. Sounds good for Bigfoot. Systematic attempts to measure and quantify aspects of behavior and processes of the mind. And again, we do that by first observing Bigfoot behavior, creating hypotheses that target Bigfoot's thinking or mind, and verify those through experimentation and analyzation and replication. I'd also like to draw your attention to the fact that aspects of behavior and the processes of what? Not the brain, processes of the mind. Many of us increase our association between processes of the brain and processes of the mind. And in fact, they're two different things. The mind itself is more than the sum total of the neurologic, neurochemical, neuromagnetic exchanges going on in the brain between brain cells or neurons. Just those things going on is a function of the brain. But those things going on properly is what creates a mind which functions as a higher level of functioning than the bare mechanics and inputs of the brain. An adoption of procedural safeguards, increasing the objectivity and reduce the ever-present danger of personal biases. So the procedural safeguards refer to how you design your experiment. It's how you design your experiment that determines whether you're picking up on personal biases. And having those or other environmental factors come in and influence your research, your experiment, that is. You keep complete records of observation and data analysis in a form that other researchers can understand and evaluate, and you communicate one's findings and conclusions in a way that allow independent observers to replicate or repeat your experiment and the findings, or to reject the conclusions. You got to be organized enough. Your notes need to be clear enough that other researchers can go in and perform your experiment and get your thoughts on the experiment as you're moving through it. Such research seeks to discover the structure of behavior and the psychological processes, as well as their causes and determinants. To find structure and interrelationships, correlational methods and analysis should be used. To discover answers about causality, experimentation must be used. And this is a very important point, something I alluded to early. Correlational methods are still considered more of a descriptive statistics, describing the characteristics of the population, or I'm sorry, of the sample, and their relationships with similar or differential individuals within the group, or between different groups, like between Bigfoot and humans, as Dr. Fehrenbach did there. So that's still not what's called an inferential statistic. In inferential statistics, we use all those descriptive statistics, and we do more formal statistics known as t-tests or z-tests or factor analysis. Those things are called inferential statistics. That's where we take the phenomena that we see in the field and in the numeric data under the normal curve, and we take our ideas or hypothesis about what that tells us, and then we do inferential statistics, because inferential statistics allows us to generalize from the Bigfoots in our sample to the Bigfoots in our population. Our sample being the Bigfoots we measured, the population of Bigfoots being what you believe the overall number or actions or activities of all the Bigfoots in the United States are in this case. So my point being, you got to use statistical inferential statistics to discover answers about causality. It says experimentation must be used. No one that I'm aware of, and please, if I'm wrong, correct me, because I would love to meet somebody else who is doing statistical analysis and inferential statistical analysis with their data. But even the big organizations who organize expeditions, they do a fine job on the front end. You even gather data. You make notes about what you heard at what time or what you did at what time for a provocation. You write all that stuff down as you're doing it. You're distributed in the Bigfoot area so that you can't hear another group making a call. Or if you heard another group making a call, they wrote down the time that they made that call, and you can compare that to the time that you thought you heard that genuine Bigfoot call. All of that, I applaud. That's awesome. You come back, some people that night, mostly the next morning, you debrief with each other. You talk about this and sort out what was real versus people stepping over each other. So that much structure and that much ability to tease out whether it was a Bigfoot call or another expeditioner making that Bigfoot call are all awesome. But I've yet to go on any expedition where then those notebooks are held on to and those behavioral descriptions are reduced down to numeric values so that you can then do a statistical analysis. So here's part of the irony of it all. In 60 years of doing Bigfoot research the way we've barely moved an inch in terms of our ability to prove the scientific existence of Bigfoot. But the good news is, even those skills and that kind of experiential or phenomenological research is still important or necessary, because that's going to shine the light on where we need to focus our scientific experiments and analyses. So to prove causality, again, you've either got to have 100% relationship. Every time one thing happens, this happens. Every time you make a tree knock, they respond with a tree knock. Well, even through descriptive statistics or even just through experience, we know already that that's not the case. If you've been out on these organized expeditions and you've made a tree knock, more often, I don't know the statistics is part of it, and that's part of the problem. But there are frequent times where you get no response from that tree knock. And you know what? In your notes, you've got to be noting that. Made tree knock at 2:50 a.m. in the morning, no response. Later on, made another tree knock or made a whoop at 4:30 in the morning, got a whoop back. You got to record not only your successes, but you've also got to record your failures, because success and failure is important to keep track of in terms of your hypothesis and whether it's a strong one or a weak one. So you can only use correlational methods in terms of descriptive statistics, but to prove causality, you've got to get down and go into inferential statistics, generalizing from your sample and the behaviors your sample are emitting to the overall population, or all of the Bigfoots in the United States would be an example of a Bigfoot population. This is achieved within a framework of functional analysis, internal organismic factors, contributions versus external environmental factors, contextual influencing factors, and using techniques to enhance objectivity, defining variables operationally, spell it out. How do we interpret Bigfoot happiness? That's the beginning of a hypothesis. That's the question. How do we know, and can we track Bigfoot happiness? Okay. And you operationally define what Bigfoot happiness is. A seeming smile on Bigfoot's face, Bigfoot chuckles or laughs, any signs that you think represent Bigfoot happiness. And then your test will be, in fact, testing if that represents Bigfoot happiness. Could it represent Bigfoot excitement? Could it represent Bigfoot luring you in to eat you for lunch? We don't know until we run those statistics. Otherwise, we're adding error, systematic error, into our experiment, and our experiment is going to be less likely to succeed if our observations and interpretations of those behaviors without statistical analysis have been correct. Our research should build reliability and validity into it, differentiate between coincidence, correlation, and causality, and provide ethical safeguards for the subjects, the data, the results, and their use. Okay. Reliability. We're measuring the same thing every time we try to measure it. If we're measuring Bigfoot happiness, each time we call it happy, we've used that same set of descriptors about what constitutes Bigfoot happiness, and all researchers use those same descriptors or standards. Validity is, are we actually measuring what we're saying we're measuring? Whereas reliability is, are we measuring that thing correctly each time and getting the same results? Coincidence, correlations, and causality. I've had a whole show on that. Coincidence happens every now and again, and it doesn't mean the shorts you're wearing are causing that to happen. Correlations, maybe there is a relationship, a co-relationship between gifting food and you getting something gifted back. It happens sometime, but not all the time. So they have a co-relationship with each other, but it's not a causal relationship, because every time you leave out food or a gift, sometimes it's ignored. And not only are we providing safeguards for the subject, in this case Bigfoot, I really do believe we need a code of ethics for how to treat Bigfoot and implement that in our research. You're also providing safeguards for the data, the raw data and the numeric data, the results when you do your analysis and what comes out, and then how those results are used. Whose hands do you put them in? Who's going to be replicating your study? So now we've come to that magic moment. Although I've been describing the steps of the scientific method throughout my narrative, we come to the steps of the scientific method. The first one is you make an observation. Well, I noticed fish aren't on the land, but they seem to be in the water. Okay, that's an interesting observation. You ask a question. Do I want to catch fish? Am I more likely to catch a fish if I put my bait next to the log in the water or next to the log on the land? So that's our operationalized definition of what catching fish means. And we're trying to determine whether your lure is on the land or in the water influences if you catch fish. So you go down the bank casting in those into those locations. You form a hypothesis or testable explanation. Here's where the Bigfoot community is falling down terribly. We go from observation to theory. Never test hypothesis or testable, not never, rarely do we go through the hypothesizing portion. We make a prediction based on that hypothesis. I hypothesize that if I make 500 casts that land next to the log in the water with my bait, that I will be more likely to catch a fish than if I make 500 casts that land next to the log on the land. We're manipulating our experimental variable, where we fish. Test the prediction. Make 500 casts to the log in the water. Let your bait sit a few minutes, 20 minutes, while you drink beer, of course, if you're a fisherman. Count how many fish you catch. Now make 500 other casts to the log on the land. Let your bait sit for 20 minutes while you're still drinking beer. If at the end of this you can still count past zero, you then count how many fish you have in each group. And the differences between those two groups are going to tell us the answer. Iterate or reiterate. Reiterate is when you've done something successful that you just want to do another time. You want to replicate. People are going to want to replicate your study. So that's a reiteration. An iteration is when your experiment fails and you have to go back to the beginning of hypothesis formulation and testing. You don't publish in a journal, a peer-reviewed journal. Speaking of peer-reviewed journals, I only know of one in our community, That's Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum's relict hominin or hominid, I forget. If you want to get your mind blown, go to his website and try and read one of those essays or try and read one of those experiments that won recognition in his journal by including them in the relict hominid publication. Be prepared to have your mind blown or at least bent. So we're continuing with the experiment, and it comes out, and we're publishing, repeating, or it fails, and we're iterating. We're starting fresh. And then just a disclaimer here: it doesn't have to be beer when you're out there doing this experiment. You could use water or food and well-advised substitutes for the beer. But if you're a real fisherman, it should be beer. Okay, here's the big moment. The scientific method. I handmade this slide. I couldn't fit it into one page. So we've got 2 pages modeling the scientific method, or a paradigm, if you will, Jessica, for the scientific method. I couldn't find one that suit my fancy, so I kind of made my own graphic here, but I couldn't get it into one page. I'm sorry. But the scientific method starts with an observation. Geez, it looks like the fish are in the water. You ask a question. Can I catch more fish on the water or more fish when the bait's on the land? You form a testable hypothesis. You predict your results based on that hypothesis. You formulate your experiment, and then you do your experiment, gather your data for the land, bait sitting on the land, and the bait sitting out in the water, and to see if there's a statistically significant difference. Yeah, I did the same last time. If your study proves out that you catch more fish in the water, then you you reiterate and you publish your results in your peer-reviewed journal, and you let other scientists review your work, and then you start doing that same thing again, identically, because it worked. Now, if, however, your data bears out that you catch more fish from the land, then you got to go through an iteration, because fish only live in the water. Now, there are some fish like mudcat that can survive out of water and climb out of the water. There's a fish, I think it's a type of catfish, that can literally walk across land from one pool to another. So it's not a complete causal relationship between fish and water. There are some fish that temporarily live on land, and so it's not 100% correlation. There's not a causal or lawful relationship between fishing on the land and fishing on the water. You follow me? Sounds strange, I know. So, but when your data doesn't come up consistent with what you're finding, you do not publish, do not pass go, and you form another testable hypothesis, or you alter your experimental design to better capture that hypothesis. And this is one of the nice biasing things about science. If you don't get the results you want, try it again. If you don't get those results you want, try it again. If you don't get those results you want, try it again. I think baseball is the only sport where you get 3 strikes before you're thrown out. And somebody in the show last night asked an awesome question, which was, do you have to tell them how many times you failed as well as how many times you were successful? Yes. You have to tell them the failures and successes of your experiment to be able to share notes and help others refine their experiment and their hypothesis. So, as you might imagine, there are some researchers who are better than others. In an ideal world, we'd like to hit that target with that arrow, the Bigfoot and Bigfoot behavior attributable to a Bigfoot, and being able to prove that it's distinct from human behavior. That's your target. You're hit, the refined and up-to-date researcher will hit their target. So think of this target as a target with Bigfoot at the center of the core, and 6 different experiments that tell us something about Bigfoot behavior. What could we do? Tree knocks, compare tree knocks to stone clacks, or compare tree knocks by humans to tree knocks by Bigfoot. And I've got an experiment that I outline in my book on how to do that. So that's one study. Another study on vocalization comparisons between humans and Bigfoots. Another study, hopefully, thank you, Dorby Orcutt, the differences between human DNA and unknown species DNA, be the third arrow. The fourth arrow could be footprint sizes. They've already been compared to humans in Dr. Fehrenbach's study. But that'll be yet another arrow, another Bigfoot phenomena, another behavior that, if done properly, now you've got 4 arrows hitting that same bullseye target. Fifth arrow, woo phenomena. Figuring out whether, and I hate to equate woo with infrasound because there is some physical evidence associated with infrasound in other species, but we still haven't scientifically verified it in the Bigfoot species. And that could be done. And we could investigate, are we getting ourselves psyched out and having fight flight? Are we doing it to ourselves? Is just the sight or threat of Bigfoot doing it to us? Or is it in fact the infrasound that the Bigfoot emits? And this study could be done with enough funding in a laboratory and without ever having a Bigfoot captured, because we've got audio tapes that have been expertly confirmed as showing different sounds and frequencies of utterance, and the literal sound wave frequencies of utterances than humans, than bear, than other creatures in nature. So now we've got 5 things hitting that target. And what would be the 6th thing hitting that target? Let's go back to woo. Let's make it mind speak. We believe Bigfoot has mind speak. The nice thing about psychological experimental design is we can differentiate and figure out scientifically if there's mind speak going on between Bigfoots and humans, behaviorally, with a behavioral experiment. Pretty easy, actually, as long as you got a good psychic, and I say that with sincerity. But so you got 6 pieces of data coming to bear on the target of Bigfoot, and all these measuring Bigfoot phenomena. And you got good scientists doing it, and you hit that target 6 times, hit bullseye 6 times. Think about that. Think about the Patterson-Gimlin film. How many arrows on Bigfoot do they have? They have the video. They have the sighting itself. And then they have the foot casts that were found to be Bigfoot-like, according to, I forget who owned those, but they were later reevaluated by Dr. Meldrum, and he's one of the best world qualified people to make a judgment if they're genuine or faked. So you've got 3 arrows hitting the target with the Patterson-Gimlin film. Has that been enough to be accepted by science? In science proving it's a species. So that's why we need 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 arrows hitting that represent phenomena and behaviors of Bigfoot, hitting that target. And once those numbers being using statistical analysis keep hitting that target, whether or not they've ever seen a Bigfoot, if we keep hitting that target, that's going to give us the scientific statistical evidence that Bigfoot exists. Hope this is making sense. But as we know, not everybody's a good shot. And so it's not just going to be the expert, I hate to use the word expert, the trained and finely tuned scientific researcher will shoot their arrows, and their research will either hit the target or somewhere around it. But somebody who's not as well trained in experimental design, they're going to draw their bow and they're going to hit out there in the white edge. And then everybody else and their mother shoots their arrows, and you can see that some land close to the bullseye, some in the bullseye, some in the red, some in the blue, some in the black, and it looks like a lot in the white. So it's not necessarily that easy to get that 6 to 10 replicated studies that strike the target on Bigfoot. This is a more realistic picture of what investigation is going to look like than this picture. God, that sounds like a lot of work. I don't know what you think. And yes, it is. A lot of work. If I had a team of 100 people to spread out throughout the United States, we could do that. But it's a lot of work, a lot of coordination, a lot of structure. It takes lots of time. It's expensive. The statistical analysis packages are expensive. Finding someone other than me that understands statistics well enough to do the statistical analysis, studying the results, reporting the results, interpreting the results, writing your results up in a paper, peer review, replication, or iteration. That just seems like too much work to do. What do you think? Well, I'll put it this way to you. If we had been doing this kind of science, even this kind of sloppy science, with so many of our hypotheses not even being close to the bullseye, if we had been doing this for the past 60 plus years, we'd probably already have Bigfoot proven as a species. So that makes it important where our current research model is falling down, because we're doing the stuff that could tell us descriptively about Bigfoot, as Dr. Fahrenbach did there, as I read through his results of his investigation. But we're not reducing, for the most part, most people, most researchers aren't reducing the numbers down to, aren't reducing the raw data down to numeric data to do a statistical analysis. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry, but until we get more people investing in learning how to do that rather than a FLIR, our cost is our goal is lost. Groups need to stop investigating in new FLIRs, new radar. You guys started investing $1,000, $1,200 into a statistical analysis package if you want to scientifically prove the existence of Bigfoot. If you don't want to scientifically prove that, don't bother. Keep running around the woods, gathering good qualitative data that could be converted into numeric data and a scientific exploration done, or start structuring your expeditions with experiments so you're getting experimental data that you can eventually analyze. Until that shift happens, we're either going to have at least two bodies, in my opinion, be they killed or cadavered, found laying dead. Finally, the big one. Here we're looking at we're looking at the influence of not using a complete scientific method on your outcome and in your research, compared to completely using the scientific method and your outcomes and your research. So this is the birth of a biased Bigfoot theory. You have a Class A or B sighting. You haven't read my book on how to reprogram your fight-flight response and emotional reactions to an A or B class sighting. So you likely have a stress response that may or may not include fight, but your arousal or level is not at its most efficient, which then contributes to bias in your observations, your perceptions. And so you got the second arrow down, that leads to a large bias window. That large bias window, then these observations are put together using those biases, and you develop a belief that you express as a theory. You test that theory, next line going across, you test that theory just by observational data. You're already into a biased interpretation of what you're seeing. And then you keep doing that, and due to either coincidence or correlation, you've got a biased theory. Notice how you're going from, basically, if you simplify it, you're going down from an observation to a theory, to a certain theory. And you get in this confirmation cycle between not using the hypothesis testing, reconfirming your bias theory, confirming your bias theory, and before you know it, you've got all kinds of theories that may or may not be correct because you completely missed the step of experimentation and experimental design to produce raw data, to produce numeric data. This is where the current Bigfoot research model completely tanks and sets us up for failing to be able to use our data to scientifically prove Bigfoot exists. You can see that chart. You're going from observation to a belief that's incorrectly expressed as a theory, because there's a big difference between a belief and a theory. A belief should go from a belief to a hypothesis to an experimental design, repeatedly confirming and hitting that target before it then we begin to think about something as a theory. And we're going to talk about that more here. So that last slide I showed you was the result of impartially and incorrectly using the scientific method. Let's look at what happens different when you use the scientific method. And this is the birth of a scientific Bigfoot law. You have an A or B sighting. You've read my chapters on how to reprogram your fight-flight response. You're still likely to have a little bit of a modulated stress, but you're going to be under better control, and you're going to be able to control your arousal, and you're going to be more accurately being able to perceive things. So rather than a big bias window being created, it's a small bias window. But you still come up with that idea from that observation. But what happens? You form a tentative hypothesis and test it repeatedly down there at 6 o'clock. If you test it repeatedly and it fails, the little red lines, just as in my illustration, the failures, they iterate. They go back up to the hypothesis portion of investigation and tweak their hypothesis or reformulate a new hypothesis. And once that hypothesis is repeatedly confirmed, the information, most important for the experiencers, especially people who want to experience a type A, and I am one, or class A, and I am one of them, that repeated confirmation, if your hypothesis is correct, you'll notice the arrow, it feeds back into having a class A or class B sighting. But it also runs the other way. When you have confirmation, you have yet another sighting that you evaluate statistically and experimentally. It speaks to what you need to do with your hypothesis. If your hypothesis repeatedly gets confirmed, then you begin thinking about why could it be a theory. Once it's repeatedly confirmed by independent researchers and with or without publication. If it's not repeatedly confirmed by independent authors, it's rejected, and you go back to hypothesis testing and reformulating that. But if your tentative theory, if your hypotheses continue to hit the target, then a tentative theory is born. If they're not borne out, go back to stage 2, hypothesis reformulation, or stage 3. But if it keeps getting hit, you keep getting hits on that target, note again, that makes it even more likely that you're going to have a Class A or Class B experience. And that's going to then feed back and give you more information about your theory and other ways you might prove it. So once you've got a tentative theory born and you repeatedly test it, then you've got a theory. Once you repeatedly test the theory over and over again, then you've got a tentative law. Once you test the tentative law over and over again, then you've got a law born. All if your experiments come out at hitting the target. And each step along the way, that information is being processed back into refining either your hypothesis, your theory, so that you have what we think of as an immutable law. The law of gravity comes to mind. But if you've been following the flat earth theory, flat earthers are now challenging the law of gravity. And why or how they're challenging the law of gravity is that the law of gravity has its roots, theories, and results grounded in a model or a paradigm of a round Earth. So if there becomes a general scientific consensus that the Earth is flat, the laws of gravity are going to have to be rewritten. So I wish I had some folks here for questions. Going at a more natural pace, I'll be wrapping up at an hour and a half here. So think of your questions. We can open up our next show with those questions and kick this around a little bit further if you'd like. And if you come with questions, I'm glad people are asking more and more questions. That's part of what we need, because questioning and that skepticism, that's part of the scientific method, as is the openness. And so I hope you will continue to have an open mind. I hope you'll continue to keep your boots on the ground. And I hope you will continue to keep your heart with your higher power. I wish you a good day or a good evening, good afternoon, good morning, or good night.
I see you running out of reason. Don't try to blame it on the seasons. Why you wanna walk away? When we began, swear we had something that would last. Baby, has the feeling passed? Falling in was easy. How do I make it stay? I'll never let go of you. Tried and true. Oh, I'll never let go of you. Tried and true. Was I a fool? I know sometimes I may wonder, but I would never leave asunder a thing as good as what we have. Is it a rule? What's good is worth the fighting. There ain't no denying that you and I were made to last. Falling in is easy. How can we make it stay? Oh, Can we go back to the start? I'll never let go of you. Tried and true. I'll never let go of you. Tried and true. Tried and true.
Wanna do it all with you by my side. If you're in, meet me here tonight. Be brave and come alive.